Hey, what's up everybody? Thank you as always for stopping by the channel. I hope you're all doing fantastic out there today. If this happens to be your first time here, welcome to the Silver Screen Analysis. It's one of hundreds of channels on YouTube that talk all about movies. I do hope you enjoy this video though, and for anybody out there watching, if you like this content, consider giving it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button as well. YouTube School says I need to say that at the beginning of the video to be a successful YouTuber, and everybody wants to be successful if they're going to try to do something, right? So with the shameless promotion in the books, let's get into some movies. Today we're taking it back to the 80s and the 90s to talk about 6 forgotten actioners, movies that you may have seen once long ago, you may vaguely remember pieces of them, or you may remember seeing them on the video shelves as a kid if you're over the age of 35. Now I've been a movie geek since I've been old enough to remember things that I could actually remember. I grew up in the glorious decades of the 80s and the 90s, when the American dollar was strong and movies as mainstream media absolutely exploded. Theaters and video stores were filled with people and families every weekend, and Hollywood cranked out movie after movie and star after star, or in many cases, potential star after potential star. And I would say no genre outside of probably horror was more filled than the action genre. There was never a shortage of loud, explosive action flicks with tough guy leads, cheesy one-liners, and pointless sex scenes. I remember growing up as a kid, Thursday nights on one of the cable stations had a series called Movies for Guys Who Liked Movies, and I was a little guy in the making. I liked movies as well, so naturally I was a regular viewer. The movies were big and dumb and just absolutely over the top, and they were amazing when done right. They were still pretty enjoyable when done decently, and often mindlessly entertaining when done horribly wrong. So let's get into this list of somewhat lost action flicks that kind of came and went during the 80s and 90s that may have missed your radar, and these movies are in no particular order. First up on my list, I have a small little actioner called The Rookie from 1990.
Fasten your seatbelt.
I think this is a fun, tightly paced cop thriller directed by Clint Eastwood, who also starred in it as a detective who, after the death of his partner, is forced to team up with the rookie played by Charlie Sheen. So, yeah, it's your typical odd couple, old versus young blend of buddy cop tropes. At the time, both Sheen and Eastwood were A-listers, so I think the expectations of seeing two generations of acting talents meeting on screen ended up making this slightly above average action a bit of a letdown upon its release. I really enjoyed it though. I liked these guys paired up, and I watched it a lot growing up as a kid. I think together they have to chase down this guy who killed Eastwood's partner. He's a violent crime boss played by Raul Julia with a lot of charm and charisma. He runs this chop shop for luxury cars. Now, yeah, all this movie really is a retread of many beats that we've seen in the genre, but I think it all blends together into a gratifying adventure of violence, eccentric villainry, and amusing deadpan one-liners from Eastwood to entertain fans of action flicks. And personally, I actually liked some of the stiff chemistry between them, where some of the critics at the time said it was greatly lacking. I mean, these guys are supposed to not like each other. It really shows that they don't like each other or get along on screen, and I think that's kind of what you're supposed to want for this movie. So for me, I think they succeed in carrying out the familiar story beats of tracking down Raul Julia's character and his crime ring, and I certainly think Raul Julia was a positive in this movie. I mean, he really does feel vicious and grimy and absolutely relentless, and Julia brought just like a subtle, I would say, gravitas to the role that added some evil charm to the mood of this entire movie, despite the character being nothing more than a plug-and-play villain. It has plenty of shootouts and fights and car chases, and all of it's captured with good old-fashioned stunt work and practical effects. There's a great scene where Charlie Sheen's character just goes in a bar and goes completely unhinged in sort of a rebirth moment, and it's just delightfully gratuitous. There's another awesome car chase that ends with Sheen and Eastwood driving out of a building, and it's just all a textbook example of the explosive movies of the era that thrived on gusto and bravado. Moving on to the next movie on my list, it's an eccentric action film from 1991 called Showdown in Little Tokyo. This one featured an unlikely duo in Dolph Lundgren and the late Brandon Lee. They are partners, they're an odd couple, they make this alliance to take down the Yakuza, and it's filled with comically cheesy dialogue and some surprisingly effective chemistry between Lundgren and Lee. The martial arts action is plentiful, it's certainly a product of its era, but Lundgren and Lee have ample opportunity here to boast their skill sets as they take out waves of tattoo-covered, silk suit-wearing, sword-swinging, gun-toting members of the Yakuza. Cary Hiroyuki Tagawa was a sinister villain. He absolutely embraces this role of the stone-faced crime lord, and it does translate effectively on screen. The comedic tone here, I would say, reminds me of Tango and Cash. There's a bit of a nice balance of action and humor that complement one another nicely, so despite the dark themes, it actually has somewhat of a carefree tone as Lundgren and Lee kind of make it all work. They sell the dialogue, they land most of the one-liners, and it's all a bit nostalgically ridiculous. Admittedly, it's a bit weird to think of Lundgren as this hulking man raised under the guidance of the samurai way, but that's sort of the fun of this movie. It's all hyper-realistic, but I would say still kind of grounded in terms of being a procedural cop-themed actioner, which I think does allow the outrageousness and the adrenaline-pumping bravado to come off as kind of charming, because seeing Lundgren jumping over a car or tipping one over by hand isn't always going to work in a movie that isn't slapstick, I guess you could say, unless you're Vin Diesel. Overall, though, I'd say the movie's pretty swift. It has a tight pace, it gives you a little bit of everything. It has fights in sushi bars, nightclubs, a bathhouse. It has Lundgren throwing knives at intruders in his underwear after a textbook action movie sex scene, and it has a comically over-the-top sword fight finale, and I think all of it blended together is the total package of late 80s, early 90s action movie tropes.
Cop. Policeman. You understand? It's bad to shoot me. He's a cop too. It's bad to shoot him.
I think it's also a memorable part of the short film legacy of Brandon Lee, who delivers endless charm in this movie, Van Damme quality moves, and some of the great one-liners of the era, all in one single action-packed flick.
Just in case we get killed, I wanted to tell you, you have the biggest dick I've ever seen on a man.
Thanks.
Now for the next film, it's back to the 80s for an action thriller called Shoot to Kill from 1988. Now this was sort of like an 80s version of Cliffhanger. It was just as thrilling, but instead of Stallone and Rooker, this one delivered a very capable Tom Berenger and the iconic Sidney Poitier, and with capable performances from the supporting cast, I think it's a very underrated film. It's directed by Roger Spottiswoode, who would also go on to direct the greatest buddy cop movie of all time, Turner and Hooch.
What? What? If you're hungry, finish the hamburgers. Eat the buns. Eat the buns!
I think his direction in this one was absolutely impressive. He captures the scale, the dangers, and the beauty of the rugged terrain as FBI agent Sidney Poitier and his guide Tom Berenger traverse the treacherous mountains in pursuit of a murderer who has escaped by hiding in with a group of hikers. So it's really an engaging blend of action, thriller, and mystery. There's a killer in this group, and how the film teases who it could be adds a bit of fun whodunit charm that I think's useful in terms of overall entertainment. Now, I will say this one does start out a little bit slow as it kind of builds the foundation of the plot, but once it gets going and the characters hit the woods, I think it's constant tension, thrill, suspense, routine close calls, and excitement all the way up until the end credits rolled. Berenger and Poitier were just a solid pair here. They progressed through the usual hate to inevitable respect story arc, but I do think they're able to put their own vibe to make them a surprisingly appealing country versus city duo, and more than enough to root for here. And again, this was the late 80s, so the practical effects are a great bonus. You can truly just feel the fatigue of the lead characters and the uneasiness and the anxiety from their routine close calls, because you have stuntmen that you can see actually out on ropes, clinging to a cliff face or dangling from a rope hundreds of feet over a river and not 5 feet over a green screen, and it's all on location filming, and it results in a film that can lure you in and have your palms a little clammy if you're afraid of heights. Moving along, let's jump forward in time back into the 90s for my next pick, and that is Surviving the Game from 1994.
Going bare hands.
Now, to me, this was a surprisingly entertaining human hunting human action flick starring Ice-T as this homeless guy who thinks he's nabbed a job as a hunting scout for a group of rich assholes, only to find out that he's the one being hunted. This was kind of during the rise of Ice-T as an actor in the early 90s, and this really was his first real shot as a headliner. I do think he had a fantastic supporting cast around him, but I also would say I think he carried this movie well. The first act, which really is the only quiet moments of the movie, are surprisingly effective as you get to see T living as a homeless man with nothing left to live for. It really does build the foundation for who this guy is and what his morals are and what drives him, and it does capture some solid acting chops by Ice-T. But what I really did like about this movie is that it doesn't waste much time. It gets going quickly after an awkward, tension-filled dinner that delivers some amusing bravado, headlined by Gary Busey's show-stopping story about killing his dog as a kid. The suspense kicks in, and it never lets up. I think Ernest Dickerson's direction is capable. It's a beautifully shot film that captures the terrain excellently. I mean, even when watching this movie decades later, it hasn't really dated that much visually. I think it can still easily pull you out into the mountains with T as he fights to survive the game. And I also really liked how this one didn't turn T into a one-man army either. He isn't an ex-soldier or ex-CIA op or anything like that found himself homeless. He's just this clever dude that is kind of good with his hands that can think quickly. So I think how he progresses through this sudden predicament he finds himself in felt relatively authentic as well. I think it really is this aspect of the movie that can keep you engaged in the story and where things are going to go, and with a great cast featuring Rutger Hauer and Charles S. Dutton and F. Murray Abraham and Gary Busey and John C. McGinley, there is more than enough personality here to keep things fresh. The action is adrenaline pumping with fights and gunplay and booby traps and plenty of harrowing close calls, and it all equals a thrilling action romp that sort of got lost in the mix, but one that I think still holds up extremely well all these years later. Next, we're jumping back a few years to 1991 to talk about a great little action flick called Ricochet.
I made it!
Now, there is nothing Denzel Washington can't do when it comes to acting, and here he was fantastic as a young cop who catches a psychopath played to perfection by a seedy John Lithgow. From there, Washington's Nick Stiles sees his career ascend up to district attorney, but his perfect life is systematically destroyed when Lithgow escapes and makes it his mission to not simply kill Nick Stiles, but to make Nick Stiles wish he was dead. I know Washington has gone on to have an illustrious, award-winning career, so it's easy to see how this small little action movie / psychological thriller got swept under the rug, but I think it's a great ride. It's loaded with suspense, and while it may not have an abundance of action, when it does kick in, it's a satisfying wave of over-the-top spectacle and gritty, down-to-earth violence. But fear not, with a psychopathic villain in John Lithgow, there's still plenty of killing, the body count quickly piles up, and I gotta say, seeing him strategically dismantle this perfect life of Nick Stiles is pretty impressive. It continually escalates, and as Washington goes fully unhinged, one step at a time, the intensity ramps up nicely to the final act. It's a game of cat and mouse, mind versus mind, and it's a blissfully sadistic journey watching each one of these guys make their calculated moves against one another. It culminates in a fantastic large-scale finale that I think still holds up extremely well today. I mean, come on, you got Denzel Washington and John Lithgow, very young in their careers, both going head-to-head. They're climbing all over the Watts Towers, and it's awesome to see these two amazing talents both fully committed to sell the roles and to, I would say, kind of bring a level of legitimacy to the absurdity of it all. This movie has action, it has charm, seediness, it's clever as well, and I think that aspect of this action thriller is why it's very underappreciated. We've reached the last film on my list, and for that one it's back to the 80s for a creative little actioner called FX from 1986. I loved this movie growing up as a kid. I've rewatched it every handful of years. I still find enjoyment in seeing Brian Brown's character, a movie special effects expert, use his trickery to fight for his life. I mean, this guy's been hired by the Justice Department to stage the real-life killing of a mob boss, and he of course gets caught in the middle of a cover-up. What he knows makes him a liability, and it will take all of his special effects engineering skills to stay alive once he's been double-crossed. Many of you may not know Australian actor Brian Brown outside of being Tom Cruise's barmate in the hit film Cocktail, but he's a skilled performer. He had a solid run of smaller roles during the era. He's still working today, and I think he's more than capable here as this MacGyver-esque hero. This is a traditional double-cross thriller. I do think it follows the familiar formula, but the movie special effects angle does do a good job of giving this story a unique vibe and a fresh atmosphere. Movies in the 80s just relied on makeup work and stunts and practical effects, and that's exactly what was used here, and I would say there's something a little sentimental about watching Brown's character use old-fashioned squibs and mirror screens and various other filmmaking props and prosthetics to routinely escape death and to get the upper hand on his enemies. But in addition to that, there's also plenty of typical action as well to add into the adventure. There's gunplay, chase sequences, some fights as well, and it's all packed into a tight runtime. I think given the time period this movie came out, it could have easily tried to do too much and become too fantastical, but it really doesn't do that. It keeps a very grounded tone. I think there's a practicality to a lot of the situations in the story, and I think that's what makes it such a good time, because I think there is sort of an element of plausibility to most of what you see here on screen, where usually in the genre at the time, stories were extremely exaggerated. In this one, I think it all kind of blends into a slick action thriller with Brown carrying the lead, and the great Brian Dennehy coming in to serve up a fantastic supporting performance to add some appeal to this movie as well. And that was my list of 6 forgotten action flicks from the 80s and the 90s. Let me know what some of your picks are down in the comments. I really do hope you guys enjoyed this video. I have a lot of other similar ideas that I want to kind of play with and test out over the next handful of months, and I truly hope you guys will stick around and have fun with the videos. I definitely still will be putting out written reviews over at silverscreenanalysis.com. My Godzilla vs. Kong review is up on the site now. I'll link it below if you guys want to check it out. And as always, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.